Two of the things which have happened since the invasion of Ukraine is firstly that Finland has joined NATO as the 31st member, and secondly, in March this year, Sweden has joined as the 32nd member. Now, what this actually means is that you've got a strategic dilemma for Russia in the notion that the Baltic is now a NATO lake. So you have 9 countries which surround the Baltic region, Russia, and 8 others, which all appear to be NATO members or are NATO members. And therefore, the notion that Russia would do any overt action on Gotland and any sort of invasion is farcical. The notion of that just isn't credible. Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor to US Central Command.
So, Chip, if you wouldn't mind starting us off then, what do you believe are the basis for these fears that have come out then in the last 24 hours or so?
I think really it's more to do with the notion of deterrence and the democratic inattention that we've had recently. Because if you look at this from a geostrategic and geopolitical perspective, two of the things which have happened since the invasion of Ukraine is firstly that Finland has joined NATO as the 31st member, and secondly, in March this year, Sweden has joined as the 32nd member. Now, what this actually means is that you've got a strategic dilemma for Russia in the notion that the Baltic is now a NATO lake. So you have 9 countries which surround the Baltic region, Russia, and 8 others, which all appear to be NATO members or are NATO members. And therefore, the notion that Russia would do any overt action on Gotland and any sort of invasion is farcical. The notion of that just isn't credible. What is credible, of course, is that they would take hybrid action in the region, including off Gotland, and actually in terms of territorial encroachment in Finland and some of the islands of Finland. And again, this week we've had talk of that Russia intends to recalibrate the coordinates of its territorial waters to alter the sea boundaries. Now, it's pushing back against those sorts of things which happen. It's not only those things which are on the surface, there's of course also the subsurface things where we see hybrid warfare, where, for example, the Russian research ship, the Admiral Vladimirsky, recently has been data collecting on wind farms, gas pipelines, power and internet cables. So those are the notions that would encroach, along with, of course, over the last 10 years, there have been encroachments on the sovereign airspace of Gotland and Sweden, and that's against the Chicago Convention, which does give you the parameters of where you're allowed to fly in either sovereign airspace or international airspace.
So the fears perhaps unfounded and maybe something for further down the line, but I perhaps would suggest there's no doubt that if Putin was able to put this plan into place that has been suggested, he would actually probably like to.
Yeah, but he can't. So if you look at this being the 80th anniversary of D-Day and go back to the early 1950s, where the two principal protagonists in the military hierarchy on that day, Eisenhower and Montgomery, in the early 50s, they were both SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, and Deputy Supreme Allied Commander. And Montgomery's line at the time, early 50s, was that the test match has been postponed indefinitely due to the deterrent effect of the Western alliance. That still pertains, and even more so with the addition of Finland and Sweden.
So what kind of pressure then do you think Putin's almost trying to be put under slightly then by what we've heard come out of Sweden then? What's the sort of, you sort of explained the background to it, but what's the actual sort of reasoning, do you think, for coming out now, Sweden?
Well, partly the reasoning, I think, is that Sweden has taken the rearmament, as it were, seriously. They're going to 2.5% of GDP, and they'd like to see other people do that in NATO. And of course, just after the election, we have the 75th anniversary NATO summit in Washington, where I think that will be a pledge that people want. And also, it's pretty inconvenient for any newly elected prime minister, whoever that may be. So it's really to have the conversation so that we don't go down the appeasement route. because appeasement is the way that the test match will actually have to be played, and that's not a route you want to go down.
And this idea of Gotland, then, why have they focused on Gotland specifically, do you think? Is it location, basically, within the Baltic Sea?
Well, that's where it's sort of slightly anomalous, because there's no way in terms of the geography, either from St. Petersburg probably being 300 miles or the Kaliningrad Oblast being at least 100 miles, that you could do anything in a encroachment sense, in an invasion sense. And one of the things about if you're going to do any amphibious operations is don't go along large spheres of water, because they're incredibly complex operations. But I think it plays with the what we call the CRINC countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, because simultaneously we've got this notion that China don't recognize the median line in the Taiwan Straits, which has been the line demarcating Taiwan and China for the last 70 years. So if you no longer acknowledge something, then you see what the reaction of other states are, because you can always have outliers in the international community you can peel away. So it's really trying to see who those outliers are and reinforce from the NATO perspective those who do see this as a threat for the future.
There's also this issue that the article mentions of the Åland Islands. Is that something that also should be taken into consideration?
Well, I think all these things play into this. This is the thing about trying to build your consensus for territorial encroachment and what the reaction of other forces are. So we're seeing this both in terms of Finland and Sweden. But basically there is a strategic deficit from the Russian perspective. One thing we get wrong about Russia is that it's actually a continental power with inconvenient sea flanks. We've seen one of the inconvenient sea flanks in the Black Sea. We're now really seeing, because of the fact that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, another inconvenient sea flank in the Baltic.
And the other issue or sort of point mentioned is this idea of the aging oil tankers. I mean, again, is this something really to be worried about?
No, I don't think it is. But again, it's that notion of encroachment. When we talk about hybrid warfare, we talk about things like territorial encroachment, information ops, both propaganda and subversion. And these all play into what Russia is going to do. One of the things it's not going to do is open a second flank in military terms against any NATO country when we're almost approaching the point where it's lost 500,000 people, at least if you believe the statistics from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. It's to be taken in consideration, but it really just plays again into this way that we look at hybrid warfare, either territorial encroachment by deniable assets and, of course, deniable attacks are one of the ways that you do hybrid warfare. Nord Stream 2, for example, whoever did that, along with the use of proxy forces, information operations, including in subversion and propaganda. And one of the things the Russians are trying to do is to use both propaganda and subversion to see who those outliers are in the West, who they can exploit for the future, either in terms of negotiations or to split them away from the Western community.
I mean, any word at this point as to who those could be?
Well, we've already seen the outliers in terms of Hungary, for example, and certain elements in society from all the democracies which you can peel away. So, for example, that is both the extreme right-wing elements in countries and the extreme left-wing elements. And this is where democratic elections are always a potential problem, in that you can micro-target and do particularly spearfishing in various constituencies. If there's going to be, for example, a 49 to 51% split, if you micro-target on specific issues in constituencies, which we might see, for example, in the UK on the Gaza issue, then you can alter elections. We know that occurred in America in 2016 in various places, for example.
And just lastly then, to sort of summarize, essentially the threat, I guess what you're saying is any threat is always there, but we sort of have to put into perspective things that are more or less likely to happen.
I think so. We always look at scenarios, and threat from our perspective is always intent capability and opportunity. They don't have the opportunity to do anything in an overt sense. They don't have the capability at the moment overtly because of the war in Ukraine, but they do have the intent to upset the balance in the Western alliance. So don't be complacent. And they're not, in terms of NATO, in the undersea environment, for example, by the fact that at Northwood there's a new NATO undersea capabilities and maritime monitoring to ensure that we can deal with this in the future.
Okay, lovely stuff. Chip, thank you very much for talking to us.